One. Hi everyone. Oh, you want me to- Hi everyone, and welcome to On Coloniality. I'd like to welcome our moderator, Dr. Julia Medina, to get the session started. Following the session, please stay put. We will have Q&A from the audience. We'll have a mic, or it's a small group enough, so we'll have, if you guys could just speak loudly to ask your questions. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here and joining us today. I'm humbled to be part of this conversation with my esteemed dear colleagues, so I'm glad to share the space with you. And now, consistent with the title of the panel on coloniality, I would like to start by acknowledging the ground in which we stand, as we stand on land that has been home to the Kumeyaay people from time immemorial. This is a traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation, and we want to pay respect to the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to this ancestral land. So I think that's the only way we can start any conversation on coloniality, and I'm going to introduce my dear colleagues. Jose Masankei Diaz is Associate Professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of San Diego. She received her PhD in Literature at the University of California, San Diego in 2014, and was visiting scholar with the Asian American Studies Center at the University of California, Los Angeles in 2018-2019. Her research and teaching focuses on questions of race, gender, and subjectivity as they relate to histories of colonialism, liberalism, and authoritarianism. Her writing appears in Social Text, Critical Ethnic Studies Journal, Science, Journal of Asian American Studies, and Critica Cultura. She serves on the editorial board for the Critical Ethnic Studies Journal and the Asian Journal of Women's Studies. Her next research project locates Filipinx labor as a mode for studying political crises across locations and historical periods. She's also a founding member of the Asian Solidarity Collective in San Diego, a grassroots organization dedicated to political education and solidarity movements. So here's welcoming Joseph. And my dear colleague Atrie Kukang is professor of English at the University of San Diego. Her research focuses on post-colonial world literature and theory, specifically those of the Anglophone Global South. She is the co-editor of 2 volumes of South Asian fiction, and her articles and chapters on Indo-Caribbean writers and indenture cultural history have appeared in the Journal of Caribbean Literatures, Windrush, Rethinking Post-War West Indian Literature, and Caribbean Literature in Transition, Volume 1. Her new project covers literature and other media from South Africa, Fiji, and Mauritius, and attends to the radical development of an anti-colonial past poetics with these post-indenture diasporas. So again, it is delightful to be here with these accomplished scholars. So to start the conversation and to help us, put everybody so that we're on the same foot, I wanted to go back to the land acknowledgement and just talk about what we mean by coloniality. So coloniality is a force. Colonialism is a historical period of when colonial power is put into place, whereas coloniality is the inertia and the power that continues to operate within power structures, the coloniality of power, and also the coloniality of knowledge. So it's the afterlife of the colonial world making in its reiteration, mutations, and renewals into the present and into the future. So with that understanding of what is coloniality, I will start my questions. So my first question is gonna be, well, for both of you, but in terms of Joseph, in your book you deal with questions with issues that have to do with authoritarianism, Cold War racial politics, trans-Pacific relations, and so how does coloniality figure into your work?
Thank you, Julia. So firstly, I just wanted to thank my fellow panelists here, Atrie and Julia. I think just a long admiration for your work on campus, and to be able to sort of share this space is really wonderful. So thank you. So in terms of the first question on coloniality, the Philippines, for those of you I'm sure know, the Philippines was colonized for centuries, for this Spanish Empire, was occupied for a time by the British Empire. At the turn of the 20th century by the U.S. Empire. So colonialism in the Philippine context is just, there's so much to say. I think that my book really focuses in the introduction. I say something that I'm interested in post-coloniality or post-colonialism, post-colonialism as not the end of coloniality or not the end of colonialism, but what happens when colonialism is officially declared as the end, right? So much of my book sort of thinks through that question about how coloniality transforms throughout. Really what I'm focusing on is the Cold War period, but how coloniality transforms into state policies in the Philippines, how it transforms into authoritarian policies in the Philippines, how it transforms into, figurations of nationalism in the Philippines. I'm also interested because I'm an Americanist by training. A lot of my focus is on U.S. policies as well. So I'm interested really in the ways that even with the end of U.S. colonialism in the Philippines, how what I call U.S. liberal imperialist policies actually start to take shape differently, right? Like with the end of formal declaration or the end of formal colonialism, how that starts to translate into U.S. military policies, how it starts to get, I think, re-articulated through in the book what I call again like U.S. liberal reform. So immigration policies, policies around civil rights, things like that. So really, and I think what I'm focused on is the discourses of post-coloniality, right? Like how that, even if we say post-colonial, how that actually takes on the kinds of histories of colonialism into new frameworks, into new discourses, into new laws, into those kinds of things. So, in the book, my main sort of, I think, angle of trying to study that, interrogate that, is really through figurations of race and gender, right? So I say we can see how that operates primarily through how race and gender start to shift and change, or how what we say or what we mean when we say race and gender starts to shift and change. So throughout the book, I take on issues like the Balikbayan figure, who is the Philippine immigrant who goes to the United States, so a U.S. returnee. I take on the figure of a Filipino English teacher who's teaching at the Philippine Refugee Rehabilitation Center during the aftermath of the Vietnam War. I take on the figure of what the authoritarian regime called the new Filipina woman as this sort of like new configuration of possibility and empowerment. And I take on what I'm calling a figure, which is like national culture. So I say that those figures are actually these really important ways for us to start to track what happens when we move from the colonial to the post-colonial. And again, I just want to be clear that I'm in no way sort of articulating that colonialism has ended, but I think that there's a way that how people talk about it or how policies shift and change starts to look different. And so that's really what I'm trying to, I think, trace in the book, those shifts, those changes, how the discourses about race and gender also start to change in the period.
Thank you. And for actually the same question, but as it relates perhaps more to questions of pluralization, trans-territorialization, and also trans-Pacific territoriality. How does coloniality figure, and the figure of the Kalapani, how does coloniality figure into your work?
I want to as well thank you both so much for sharing this space with me, and for everyone coming out today. I know it's Saturday morning, and for my colleagues at USD coming to campus before school starts. So it's a pleasure to see you all. So just to kind of add on to everything Josen said, which is really interesting because you're speaking about material structures, political structures. My book is very literary, so I think the way my book approaches coloniality is to think about how post-colonial theories, because they were kind of created mostly by South Asian, they're driven by South Asian theorists. So my book kind of hinges on the irony of South Asian theorists that neglect, ethnic Indians from another part of the world who are of the lowest caste and the lowest classes, and therefore don't fit in the normative way that we understand Indian identities. So for me, coloniality was really a way to think about the coloniality in post-coloniality from this kind of literary theoretical framework. So for creolization, the reason I was drawn to it is because obviously in graduate school, when you do post-colonial Caribbean, you study Breath White, you study Emily Song, Maurice Condé, and they speak about how coming from labor diaspora, specifically slavery, belongingness in the new world is precisely how you create new worlds in places that you now belong to. So a nice way to understand creolization is how the foreign becomes native. It's a very American concept. So as I was reading more Indo-Caribbean authors, I was thinking about how they weren't really allowed to belong in the Caribbean. It's very complicated to call yourself Indian in the Americas when you're from India, because obviously you don't want to sort of it's a very weird way to fit into that phrase, because you want to also acknowledge that American Indians have a right to call themselves American Indians if they want to. And so, anyway, that's a different discussion. But so reading more about this literature, I was noticing that Indo-Caribbean authors were constantly speaking about not belonging to the Caribbean. So my book is very much about unbelongingness, specifically as diasporic indentured societies, and also not belonging in this kind of post-colonial Indian category. So kind of not belonging anywhere. So for those who don't know the phrase Kalapani, it literally means black waters. It comes from a casteist framing. If you go into the diaspora, you erase yourself from the consciousness of the motherland. So you've entered the black waters of the imaginary. Of course, if you're rich enough and have enough status, you can do rituals to re-enter Indianness on the mainland. But if you're poor and you can't return, you have no way to even return into status. So one of the things my book is looking at really is to think about, as I said before, the coloniality of post-colonialism in literary theory, but also to give people who are from the Kalapani diaspora a poetics. A poetics of unbelonging, I think is what I call it. So that's how I approach it. Very different from yours, in the sense that it's very theoretical, but one of the part of my title is the power of the imaginary, right? So letting people imagine what hasn't yet become is a powerful way to start a different kind of new world.
So I'm going to follow up on what you were just mentioning, but first I want to read the title of the books because I just realized we didn't. So Akshay Fulkan's book is Contradictory Indianness, Indenture Creolization, and Literary Imaginary. And the books will be on sale outside of this theater, and the authors will be signing the books. So please consider getting a signature from these stellar scholars. And Joseph's book is Postcolonial Configurations, Dictatorship, the Racial Cold War, and Filipino America. So these are the titles we're talking about. So although it's true that your works are different in terms of space and even perhaps subject matter perhaps, but I think they share this question of cartographies, of providing some sort of cartography for thinking not just identities and literary canons and historical periods such as the Cold War, but also cartographies of conceptual and theoretical cartographies. And so in that regard, and cartography also, I find it fascinating, in, for example, for you, Audrey, I'm going to start with you in this case, the cartography of the Kuli, right, or the indenture poetics. So how does your personal experience contribute to your work?
My personal experience.
Or your positionality, I guess, if you will.
Julia, who is one of the few people who has actually read my book. It's true, my father is the other one. She was asking why I was nowhere in the book. So thank you for that question.
She didn't want me to ask her.
I'm not really sure why I hide myself in the book, even though I think research is very personal. it always is, even if it doesn't seem to be. So I think perhaps if I must answer this question, first of all, I don't. Let me restart. When I first started to read V.S. Naipaul, who is everywhere in my book, the most famous, obviously, Indo-Caribbean and Caribbean writer. When I first started to read him, it was the first time I had read a book that spoke to me. But he was speaking about, the house for Mr. Biswas, this Indian man who just could not even build a house for himself in Trinidad. So I really was wondering why that book just spoke to me in a way that, I had read a lot. I'm a literature student. And I realized it's because I grew up in Bahrain. I went when I was very small. And I thought I was Indian because most of my parents' friends were from India. Then I went to India when I was in college, and I realized that I wasn't really Indian the way that Indians think of me. So I think the title of my book, Contradictory Indianness, is just my own way to understand what it means to be an Indian who didn't realize that they weren't one until they went to India. Because uh, I'm from Northeast India, so we are very different from the other part of the mainland. So in my book, it talks about how these authors that I read, starting with V.S. Naipaul, are just a way that I understood how unbelongingness can be its own form of it, because it's a form of becoming, which is perhaps more important. So, but thank you for that question.
Thank you for answering. And as far as you, Joseph, the cartography that I see in your text, there's many cartographies as it relates to the Filipino experience, destabilizing the division between Filipino and Filipino American experience, but also the cartography of Cold War politics and also the interdisciplinary cartography of your methodology, which runs through literature, visual culture, public art. And how does your position stand in relation to the research you do?
That's a great question. In part because I think there's the context for the both of us, right?
Mhm.
The maybe outrightly discussing our position isn't quite clear in the book, and I wanted to address that because I've been thinking about it for so long, or at least for a week. I've been thinking about it so long in the sense that I realized that in writing the book and in my work in general, there's this sort of pushback that I have around what I think is sometimes an accusation about identity politics, right? About like, this is identity, this is me search, this is identity politics. And I know the kind of complexity of that question, but I also am under I firmly believe that a question about identity politics is one that belongs to everyone. But it also is one that in my book is about, here's how identity is actually a world, right? Like identity itself is Filipino American, but it's also about dictatorship, it's about US liberalism, it's about colonialism, it's about imperialism. And so I think some of that pushback actually came out through not necessarily inserting myself in as like, here's a Filipino American person writing about Filipino. So there's a little bit of that, and then, but in terms of just actually answering the question of positionality, I am a Filipino American scholar. I came through Filipino American studies primarily through literature, through Jessica Hagedorn's. I always say Jessica Hagedorn's novel Dog Eaters that was published in 1990, and that I found much later. But that when I found it, it just blew my entire world open. It was the first time, similar to Ache, that I had seen this and thought, like, I think this is me in this, or I think I'm relating. But then, I've carried this. I always say that Dog Eaters is both the angel and devil on my shoulders. Like every time I have a question about Filipino America, it's the one that exists always. And so part of what I was so unsettled by with that book is that Filipino America itself is not so neat, that it is homeland, it is diaspora, it is in the Philippines, it's in the United States, it's elsewhere, it's in history, it's in this period, and it's in this period. And so you'll see that reflected a lot in the book, right? That there is this sort of unsettledness about what Filipino America is. And I think within, so there's that, and that's where I'm kind of coming from as somebody who entered specifically through Filipino America, but sort of unsettled by what that means. I think it's both diaspora and homeland. I think for many, I think U.S. multi-ethnic literatures, post-colonial literatures. That is the case for many of us. But I also am the child of migrants of the martial law period, right, of the 70s throughout the 80s. All of my family migrated during that period, and not necessarily in the same way that I think a lot of much literature talks about migration during the dictatorship, which is that it was about the repression and censorship. My parents were not political activists in a very visible way. They were living on the kind of outskirts of Manila, but their migration was fueled by dictatorship as well, right? They were, my mom was a midwife in West Germany, traveled in 1975, came to the US through that route. My dad was positioned by his brother, who was a former, was a Navy vet. And so they're also migrating in that period that is spurred by dictatorship, but spurred through the kinds of circuits that surround dictatorship. Dictatorship is about repression always. It's about political repression, it's about violence. And it's also in the Philippines in particular, it's about the kind of US-Philippine policies that are spurring migration in a really clear way. Like the labor export program in the Philippines started in 1970, like in a really institutionalized way, started in 1974. It was a dictator's policy. So when we talk about migration in the Philippines, from the Philippines to elsewhere, it's like so centered in this period. And I'm interested in that period. I'm interested in like when I'm talking about US-Philippine relations or when I'm talking about authoritarian policies, I'm talking about a lot of different things that are coming up as well. And so I'm hoping that the interdisciplinary piece of that book sort of shows that it's like these multiple things that we have to look at when we're thinking about authoritarian nationalism, authoritarian policy. So yeah, I think both I'm in it. Lots of people I love are in it, right? But it sort of reflects, I think, a lot of things about me that I don't necessarily say outrightly in the book.
Yes, well, thank you for allowing me to bring that out. And to bring it back to this context of the book fair or the book festival, I will position myself a little bit just to make another, connection between the both of your books, which is I'm a Central American and a Central American scholar, and also I work on Trans-Caribbean research. And so my work is outside of big fields. It's outside Latino studies. It's outside Caribbean fields. It's outside U.S. Latino. And both of your works are also sort of, not neatly positioned within the dominant discourses, whether it be Caribbean literature or South Asian literature or Filipino literature or ethnic studies. So how was your experience in the publishing industry, considering the ambivalence of the topics that you deal with? Starting with you.
I'll start with the U.S. Cold War. I think that the way I teach the U.S. Cold War in my classroom is that oftentimes it's understood as this Cold War that is primarily between larger superpowers. And so what I try to do in the book is to say that the Cold War, of course, happened as hot wars everywhere else, right? It happened as hot wars in Southeast Asia. It happened Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, all throughout Latin America. It happened all throughout the African continent. And in the Philippine case, the Cold War was so present. It was about dictatorship. Dictatorships are popping up everywhere during this period, and so when we're talking about the Cold War, we need to also attend to these places where the Cold War is happening in really clear ways as well. So in some sense, I feel like that the book, I would say, is a study of the Cold War, even though maybe Cold War scholars wouldn't say that it was, and so it remains on the periphery of that. I was trained in literature, but I feel I am deeply politically, intellectually committed to ethnic studies, and so it is. Sorry, right? I don't want to exceptionalize myself in that sense, but I think so. It's hopefully a literary study, but it's also definitely ethnic studies, as you point out. I think I try to in my attempt to really destabilize that kind of diaspora homeland, debate. Like it's sometimes in Asian studies and it's sometimes prefigured as Asian American studies, right? Depending on who you talk to. It's concerned with questions of Asian American racialization, so it's Asian American studies, but it's also concerned with place and geography, so it's Asian studies. So yeah, I think that is, and I see that with Atria's book in such clear ways as well, just around the ways that I think both of ours are trying to get to important questions about why things exist on the periphery. What that actually tells us about the broader ways we come to knowledge, you know. So yeah.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah. So how was the publishing experience for you as far as getting your book, through an editorial process and getting it accepted?
I think I would extend on what you were saying, Joseph. It's we are doing really specific topics and asking them to ask universal human questions that don't usually come to bear on, Filipino America as teaching us something about universality. It's not usually. So I think I'm trying to do something similar. But I think the way I want to kind of answer that question though is. I took, I think, almost 17 years for how I started for it to become a book. And those of you obviously here who are academics, academic books are so different from literary books. I have a colleague here who is going to speak later today about as a creative writer, but when I first started to do this work, I approached a publisher and said I want to write something on West Indian authors. And they said, no one's interested in Gujarat. And I was like, I mean West Indian, like Caribbean West Indian. So, of course, the academic world has changed a lot. West Indian is more broadly known now as being one of the ways that we speak about a part of Caribbean identity. I also wanted to include Gandhi in my work because it's so important to the end of indentureship, but also of actually continuing casteist ways of thinking about people that he used to call, the so-called untouchable caste. So he was a part of a way of deconstructing the coloniality of post-colonial, post-indentureship. But that didn't work for Caribbean editors. My book wasn't Indian enough for the South Asian series that they had. So I think what really saved me is that this book is really about creolization, which is very important to the American context, because the entire Americas is settler continents, and creolization is a way in which different settler, indigenous, neo-settler communities all have to imagine their belongingness in these new worlds. So I think for me, focusing on the theoretical framework of creolization is the only way I was able to get this book published. Because I wanted to keep Gandhi in, I did have to actually take him out. So for me, the publishing part has been difficult lessons in giving up things just to get it published. Otherwise, you perish. But it's also been very humbling because I learned a lot from the external reviewers, but also all the different people who supported me for 16 years because I actually didn't really know what I was doing. So I didn't. It's a very new field, so I wasn't sure if I was saying the wrong things, asking the wrong questions. So it's been a hugely humbling experience to actually get to this point where I have this book. And also painful because I had to give up things, but you learn through those. So that's how it was for me.
I want to echo the humbling part. I think part of having the book out in the world is that there's all the things that I wanted the book to be, or all the things that I imagined the book is, and then people, depending on how they understand Filipino America or the Philippines, or the book takes on its own life after it's out in the world, and I think that's just been a really interesting thing to watch.
Good. And I know you said that only your father has read your book, and I said, I really don't believe that.
From cover to cover.
But seriously, so what kind of reception have you received, or do you expect to receive from the work you've published?
My auntie has said that the print is too small. So.
My dad too.
Yeah.
He was just like, I barely managed to read this.
That's right. That's right. A lot of my cousins are like, "Thank you," and then this is great. But yeah. So, but otherwise, yeah. I don't have a huge scholarship. But people have talked about there is a need to really situate it in. I was telling Leah that there's like a recent review about it being like situated within Filipino American studies, and I think it is, certainly is. But I in my head, I'm talking to so many other people, and so so many other fields, and even talking to Philippine studies in a really important way that just the receptions of it have been interesting to find a way to place it when the placelessness of it was sort of the point. But yeah.
I think the same for me. I was really actually touched by my family's enthusiasm, I have to say. But it's the same. Thank you, sign it, and then it goes some positive. But still, the support and love
Right.
for it being out there. I've also really actually liked receiving Facebook friend requests and emails from graduate students who, because when people speak about Indo-Caribbean literature, it's always Naipaul, just always Naipaul, which, he's a god for me, but there's like an entire canon that hasn't been recognized. And as my book tries to argue, Naipaul was very against the Caribbean. He was also very against India. He was just like, for himself. But there are huge, swaths of Indo-Caribbean writers who are actually speaking about what it means to be Caribbean in a very different way. And so I've really enjoyed receiving emails from the students who are like, oh, I didn't know about this author. And sort of giving visibility to those. So I'm not trying to say I have a fan club, but I'm just saying it's been nice to help younger generations because not much is written beside outside of my Paul studies. So that's been nice.
Well, I mean, you're both being very humble regarding the fan clubness or not that you've had. And I do foresee a lot of, whether it be positive or resistance to much of what you're both doing, you in terms of serialization and going outside of the black and white binary, and you going outside of this, U.S., Filipino U.S. or Filipino, and also in terms of authoritarianism. I think, this is such a timely, in both cases, such a timely conversation to, destabilize established binaries, whether it be in relationship to democracy and communism, which kind of evades the question of authoritarianism in the case of realization, whereas it evades the questions of non-black and white, presence in the Caribbean. So I look forward to those controversies coming up ahead. And so with that, I don't know if you guys have any closing words before we ask for questions from the audience. If you
Yeah, I
guys
think we do have to open up, but I want to thank you. We couldn't have added better moderators.
It's really such an ideal.
So with that, I don't know if anybody has, I have more questions. Of course, I could go on, but I'd rather open the conversation to all of you and see if you have anything for either or both of our authors.
Well, this might sound naive, but just to get people warmed up for the more profound questions, I really just want to thank you for this. I have Filipinos married into the family. My stepfather is an Indo-Caribbean who married my mother, like, what we used to call straight off the boat. Right? So, yeah. And so, I mean, he's still alive. My mother has passed on, but he's still, cared for by our family. The reason I throw that out is because I remember when I first met you, Atre, I knew nothing really about who this man was. I mean, like his history, and to a certain extent, I don't know if it's because that generation didn't speak a lot about their past, right? And of course, my mother also. I mean, the connections are just so profound in my mind right now. And I want to just thank you both for putting a light on this, There's something so wrong with not understanding our history if we're supposed to be this, great American melting pot. And then right now with this rise of global authoritarianism, I'm scared, and I can't wait to share this because my stepdad is really quite the intellect. Yeah, and so he's gonna love it, and my niece-in-law, right? they're just gonna love this as well. I mean, and my nephew will always have it too. So we don't, but to us, they're Puerto Rican, because right? None of us really claim American, right? We can't, we were denied that. And yet, and always reminded, what are you, right? So, so we had to think about that, generations in. I just can't thank you enough. I'm just like filled with such love for you all right now, Yeah, great job. Best book talk I've ever been to.
After yours.
Exactly, yes.
Let us know what they say.
Yes, please, thank you.
Well, thank you, Julia, Atre, and Joseph. This has been wonderful, and I can't wait to start reading your books. So you beautifully put coloniality within postcolonial. That's a very interesting way of putting it. And I gather by this, you talk about basically how racial hierarchies are kind of turned into hierarchies of labor, and inequality is part of that. So my question is that, where do you see the possibility of solidarity? Especially when basically, if identity politics is just like slicing the population all the time, and this overwhelming feeling that you beautifully describe of not belonging, how can you not belong and be in solidarity with others for change?
I don't know who, I think you're asking both of us, but Joseph and I were actually, I have actually read your book from book to cover. The way her book and my book actually really connect is that what we're asking is, solidarity is such a good idea, why does it happen more often? And so I think you're also asking, how do we arrive to that? But I think I don't really have, obviously I don't have an answer to something that seems to be really popular, racism, sexism. It seems not to be ending, but I think for the coloniality of post-coloniality for my book, it's interesting because it's based on caste and not so much race. And casteism is not going anywhere in India, it's actually getting worse. And strangely enough, even if you've never been to India and grew up in the Caribbean, it's still very much a part of your life, if you're part of the Hindu worldview. I think the best answer I've ever heard in my life to this question, I don't know what Joseph's going to say, is Toni Morrison, who says that, we forget there's only one race, and that's the human race. And the more we think about identity politics, we continue to give racism fuel. So unless we can find new forms of humanism, which I think we're both trying to do, right? New forms of humanism, it's going to be hard. But I don't know if that even answers your question, but thank you.
I just want to emphasize how well Atre's book does this, right? Answers the question, I think, around from the parts that I did, right? Or just answers the question around solidarity and like new solidarities, both around like I think adventure, around work, caste, race. But I'll answer the question similarly. I think in each of the chapters of the book, I try to imagine solidarity in multiple ways. So I would say, so for example, in the chapter where I talk about the Philippine refugee rehabilitation center, right, where Filipino teachers are supposed to be rehabilitating Indo-Chinese refugees, in the wake of the Vietnam War. There's a sort of hierarchical way that the center is positioning Filipino teachers as having already gone through English instruction and therefore ready to teach everyone else how to speak English, right? I say how can we imagine relations of war as a place of solidarity versus Filipinos, having ultimately that if we rethink how colonial war and imperialist war are taking place, and we can actually imagine solidarities between the teachers and the refugee students. And I think this text that I analyzed tries to do that in some strange way. There's another chapter where I talk about the the new Filipina configuration that the authoritarian regime was just touting for a decade. It was like, Filipino women are super empowered. You can be a wife and you can be a beauty queen, right? Like there's like all these like really kind of interesting ways that the dictatorship does that. And I say that there's actually a conference in the 1975 that Imelda Marcos went to where she's trying to talk about feminism in the global south, and that there's all these other kinds of grassroots organizations that are working around international sort of feminism that's starting in the Philippines, but that's imagining solidarity with third world women outside the Philippines, right? That there's like, if we think about Filipino America, the Filipino America actually lends itself to all of these like other connections that are based not necessarily around diaspora, but are based around class struggle, that are based around, like region, that are based around like histories of colonialism. And I think what I'm hoping or trying to do, and maybe not so successful at until you ask the question, because I'm like, I think that was an investment, is that there are other solidarities that are really important, that are evident in Filipino American texts, but that maybe are not so teased out. And I do think that Atri actually teases it out in the text in such like really clear ways.
Yeah. Can I just also add, I wanted to just say that when I first made the title of the book, people didn't even like Indianness. They're like, why can't you just use Indian? And I was like, because you're not really Indian. And they were really resistant to kind of the title itself saying that there is no purist way or proper way or fixed way of being Indian. So I think maybe also as soon as we're able to give up, purist or static ways of being. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Yes, please, Dr. Perez, thank you for being here. Wonderful to see you.
Thank you for a fantastic panel, just talking, which is so wonderful. First of all, I want to thank you for the best definition of coloniality I've heard, the afterlife. And, we've all been traumatized by the Maui situation. And I didn't really get what coloniality was until I started reflecting on what happened there and how all the historical actors in the colonization of Hawaii are in play right now, right down to the indigenous people praying, camping out on the land so it isn't taken over by the vulture real estate developers who are already calling. The front street has all the elements there of the Kingdom of Hawaii, the missionaries, the plantation workers, the sandalwood industry, and tourism. So if we want to look at how we resolve these differences of race and class, it's how we're going to resolve Maui as an instance of lingering coloniality where all the forces are still at play right before our eyes. It was just so stunning to me. So here we are. And I want to say something about identity politics. It's important because colonization erased our identities. It beat children up for speaking their language, whether it was Spanish or indigenous languages, or in the Philippines imposing English or whatever the hell was going on. So as we assert our culture, we're accused of having identity politics, right? And so if that's identity politics, I'm all for it, because it's about reclaiming what was beaten out of us, but still exist. I'm still kind of traumatized by Maui, but just the indigenous people there are very strong right now, and they're, praying and trying to offer their way of being as a different way to develop. And that's our task, So, anyway, it's inspiring.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to quickly respond to that as far as the coloniality and how I framed it, because it's not my framing. I married Eustace Pratt's framing on the planetary visions of her last book. So, and she also mentions in that book that coloniality is commodified and marketed in every zone of consumption. And so this is bringing me back to what you're saying about Maui and what's happening, not just in Maui, but even in this room, as we are talking about, how these books are getting marketed, where we're showing, where we're speaking, and what we're doing also at this institution as a faculty of color. So thank you for bringing that up. One more question, yes, please.
Hi, I have a question for Dr. Furkan. Thank you again for your book talk. It was incredible. With regard to like the poetics you were discussing and how people of the Caribbean were and people of the Caribbean were trying to express a new world. How were those poetics like translated into what were those types of poetics like with regard like specifically with regard to reinventing something new for themselves? Like what's fascinating, I feel like, is like there's a very common narrative of like nativism where you're trying to go back to your like your home heritage or your home culture, but I feel like in the context of your book, you're kind of needing to recreate something new. So if you have any like examples of how they were recreating that, like Eunice and then Blackwater you were discussing earlier, I'd love to just hear more about that.
Sure, yeah. I think that phrase, Kalapani poetics, is important to my book, mainly because in literary studies, it doesn't exist. I don't know if you can appreciate what I'm saying, but if Indo-Caribbean fiction, until a few years ago, was studied as social documentation, right? Oh, so Naipaul's book, this is how these people live. It was treated as fact, even though it was fiction. So my book is just trying to say, this is literature. This is about the imaginary. This is about the poetics of trying to actually, touch things they weren't allowed to touch, right? So the idea of being Caribbean as an Indian, as an ethnic Indian person was unthinkable in a poetic, imaginary way. But an example is just to use sort of older Hindu songs and kind of use the indenture environment to infuse the landscape of poetry and song. That's an example. So you would use Krishna, but he's actually in the Caribbean. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's things like just transplantation. So things like that.
Thank you.
And we might have time for one more question, but before that, I just want to remind you that the books are for sale outside. So, and that we can continue the conversation after the panel, so please feel free to stick around and talk to the authors. So I don't know if there's one last question anybody would like to address before we part ways, or comment? Well, thank you. Thank you so much.